Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Centric. This being a show where I talk about crime dramas that I watch. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Prodigal Son. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, picking up where the previous episode left off, we have Malcolm. Jeez, I started blinking on his name for a second. He's been captured by John, and now it's kind of a race against the clock to find Malcolm, because obviously Gil's working with Colette and everyone to try and get to him before it gets too late. Obviously Colette's kind of putting JT and Danny kind of on like a look at through some files and stuff like that, which JT's like, but it also shows you like JT being like, no, we should be out there, Malcolm's one of us, we should be, but she's like, no, like don't think that looking through paperwork is kind of like some rookie's job or something. He's like, yo, I'm a like he's trying to, because she's kind of, he's like, I'm a detective special agent, so it's like, but Danny's like, us working against the FBI isn't going to do anything. Working with them is going to be a lot easier than working against them. So kind of, circumventing, checking out the evidence. And I do like the fact is because, showing you that JT does care about Malcolm, but also, Danny does too, because Danny does look at Malcolm as a friend. She's looking at Lollipop and just, what they've kind of been through so far in the show, and she just can't shake it, because at first she was all about, all right, let's just go through the evidence, but now it's like, why are we just sitting here? Because it's like Malcolm is out there, like us sitting here isn't going to really help. She kind of started getting a little angsty, but obviously they look through the, from photos, and it, from what they got of John's, obviously once again all the pictures are scratched out, but the fact of the matter, well, of his face at the very least. And so they recognize the cabin, and obviously what they've learned from Malcolm most recently about like his experience with his dad, and particular, John, who was obviously once upon a time known as Paul, but real name John. Regardless, all that's going down, and it was really interesting because you have Malcolm kind of almost reveling in this situation, and it kind of shows you how messed up Malcolm is, that he's taking this opportunity to be like, oh, this is actually kind of an interesting situation, because for him he's looking at John as an involved killer, because beforehand John never killed anyone directly. He'd kill people indirectly because he couldn't bring himself. Obviously that was the whole thing, but the first person he killed by himself was Shannon. And it was like, you've shifted. No serial killers typically don't do that. Like when they have their thing, they stick to it. You change. So it means that he's like, you're evolving. And so from, a profiler standpoint, it's like, you're actually kind of an interesting specimen despite the current situation that I'm in. But the whole complicated thing is that, Malcolm is also looking at it from that perspective, but there's another perspective of him that's like, hey, kind of fearing for my life. But then there's another perspective of like, I find you interesting because you have keys to my past. Like what went down between us in that hunting trip and other stuff. Like I'm remembering bits and pieces, but he knows that John has all the keys to everything. So it's interesting because we end up finding out a little more about, because it's like, he's like, what about the woman? And just John kept getting him saying, he's like, oh, the girl, the woman, that's all you damn it care about. She's not important. Your dad took care of it. Because, he knew that she was most likely going, obviously, but for him, he just needed to know where she was, who she was, because still no lane on who she was, because Malcolm doesn't remember enough. But the fact of the matter is, the way John implies, it seems like it's something that Martin took care of on his own. So, but then he also shows Malcolm a scar, and it's like, oh, what's this about? It's like apparently Malcolm had stabbed him, and it's like, it's actually kind of a breakdown in the relationship between all of them, I guess, because obviously it's like, why didn't, because it seems like this is the last interaction John had with Martin or Malcolm, but it's like, why is that? But because like something broke down. Basically, Malcolm was defending himself and he stabbed John, but John present day stabs Malcolm back to kind of pay him back, because it's like, oh, you left me out there, you left me in that cabin bleeding, so I'm doing you the favor. Because for him, he recognizes in Malcolm, it's like, the fact is, I see you just like your dad. Like the situation is, because for Malcolm, it's, he tried to appease to him, being like, the fact is you can change, because you are proof that, basically not anyone starts off evil. No one's a serial killer, no one's a killer. You became the way you did because of the abuse you were suffered by your grandparents, because obviously you wanted to punish all these people who reminded you of your mom, people with addictions, prostitutes, because that's what your mom did. She left you, and obviously your grandparents kind of literally beat their beliefs into you, and kind of they festered that hate inside of you and made you into what you are. And, you know, obviously that kind of all got unlocked the moment you killed your grandfather. So he was kind of your first, and that kind of unlocked the pathway to make you who you are. Malcolm's trying to tell him that he can change again, but for him, he doesn't want to. In fact, he actually wants to change Malcolm, because for him, it's like, I kind of see what's really there. It's like, you have the capabilities of being a killer, you just need the right motivation. So he wanted to put, you know, Malcolm through trials. It's like, because he was born from a trial, and it's like he wanted to put Malcolm through one as well. Hence the whole stabbing him. It's like, you survived this. The fact of the matter is, you'll come out stronger and you'll become like me, because we're already kind of kindred spirits, much like he's a kindred spirit with Martin. But the fact is, it's like, you survive this, you can grow up, you can grow into kind of like this same position as me. And obviously that's not something Malcolm's interested in, because for him, it's like, I capture evil people, even though obviously you have John kind of point him in a different direction, try to tell him otherwise, you know. It is also interesting, like, while he's kind of bleeding out and, you know, a stress-induced hallucination, who does he turn to but his therapist? I mean, I guess it makes sense, because she's always kind of been, well, even present day, she represents kind of like some peace of mind to a certain extent of kind of piecing his psyche back together. So she acts like she represents that both for him as a kid as well as an adult. She's been that key figure in his life. So it would make sense, like, when you're in desperation, when your brain, your mind is in kind of a tailspin, where you're stressing out like that, you would turn to her, and she's telling him to, you know, kind of put everything aside. Don't try to force your memories. Focus on, for the first time in your life, worry about yourself. Focus on your own survival, getting him to kind of take care of his wounds by himself. Because it's like, if you are not careful, this guy will kill you. So you need to kind of find a way out of this situation, you know. So I just thought, like, when you kind of think about it in the grand scheme of things, I think that's fascinating. That is just, you know, out of anyone, he chose her, because I feel like under those circumstances, you would almost think like, well, maybe Gil, because Gil kind of looked after him. Gil's the one that took down his dad, so you'd almost think maybe that would manifest. But it's just like, as a therapist, I just think like I said, it's a very interesting choice. That, like, but like I said, who and what she represents to Malcolm, you know, speaks volumes. And the fact is, like I said, that he ended up his mind ended up conjuring up her, because I guess it's a thing of like, in this moment, I need her more than I would anyone else, you know. While all this is happening as well, Gil is trying to help out with this whole situation as well. And he turns to Colette, and it's like, okay, we could go to Jessica for help. But it was interesting because Colette doesn't trust Jessica. We still have not even touched the surface at all. Like, we haven't even grazed the surface on what Colette and Malcolm's history is. Like, why she distrusts him so much. Besides just the whole, his dad being who he is. It's, like I said, it seems personal. Like, there was some relationship there, or maybe just the way Malcolm was back then, not being the easiest to work with. Obviously his complicated relationship with the FBI and how things kind of imploded, but it seemed like things with Colette happened before then, before things kind of imploded at the beginning of the series. So I'm like, what that was exactly, like I said, we haven't gotten hint of it, but it just seemed like she just has a certain disdain from Malcolm, and it seems very personal. But beyond that, we haven't really gotten an idea. But it seems like obviously she doesn't trust Jessica either, which is kind of a shame. And she's almost kind of implying like, oh, not unless it's something else. It's like, the fact is, I wonder where she got that photo from. Obviously Gil's not trying to say, admit that it came from him, but also it seems like she was kind of implying like, oh, like, not unless there's something kind of between you and his mom, even though it seems like there is a bit of something there. I mean, it's a complicated thing. It's like, once again, it's that thing of like bonds kind of forged through tragedy, like Gil coming into their lives, so it kind of is a complicated thing, because I'm sure Jessica might look at him as like, oh, you're the dude that saved my family from my demented husband that I wasn't aware was a demented serial killer. So there's that whole situation. But obviously, he turns to Jessica to let her know, like, it's like she kind of has a right to know about what's happening with Malcolm. So he ends up telling her and trying to hope that she can look through the pictures and maybe figure something out. But it's like, well, the only person who can really help is Martin. So it's like, okay, so Gil has to turn to Martin. And Martin, I'm assuming, and the way that Martin kind of talks about it, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm assuming the last time you saw him was all those years ago when he arrested you. I think that was probably the last time he saw Gil. So this is a long time confrontation face to face. And so interesting, especially because the way Martin kind of confronts it later on, it's like the two father figures in Malcolm's life, his actual dad and the guy that's been more of a father and friend and mentor to him, But obviously it's like, because obviously it's like, oh, where's Malcolm at and stuff like that. Because I love it. It's like kind of like, because Martin doesn't look too well, and I love Gil kind of points out, he's like, oh, so we're just saying everything that we're thinking, huh? Because if so, I have some things that I could say. But it did seem like Martin was kind of a little off kilter. I immediately took this as one of two things. My mind immediately took it as, he's going to fake it and kind of manage to escape, and he's going to meet up with John later. That was my immediate thought, that this whole thing was some concocted plan. But he would have had to come visit Martin. He couldn't, like, because obviously they keep a close eye on who visits him, so it would have turned into something. But it's like, I wonder if there was like some message kind of exchange that we weren't aware of. But I'm just kind of like, it seems like it, but it's just like him kind of like the moment it becomes clear, it's like, I want to see Malcolm. It's like, Malcolm, I know everything's kind of complicated, but son, like, he's trying to talk to him and everything. Once again, it's just the whole thing of like, oh, you're trying to be, the father to him. Like, oh, how long because he talks about it later, but I thought it was kind of interesting. It more so came out when he was kind of a little doped up, because like I said, he ended up passing out. Like, it's like, what is that? Like, either he's sick. It might be a thing of like, he might be sick, but he hasn't been diagnosed yet. So that might be kind of like expediting some things. I don't know whether that's something, whether it's just kind of a natural thing of like, hey, maybe he's got cancer or something. Well, just throwing it out there. Maybe it's something like that going to add an interesting element going forward with the show. I don't really know what to make of it. It's just like him passing out, just like I said, it seemed fake, but I'm like, it seems real now. We'll have to wait and see. But obviously when he kind of got drugged up and everything, and Gil's trying to talk to him, he's like, the fact of the matter is, you came into his life as a father and stuff like that. You're trying to replace me, and talking about, I can smell Jessica's perfume on you. What you do, try and step in. The fact is, she's too much woman for you and stuff like that. But obviously, Gil is just kind of ignoring all that, because the sad thing is, because even he said it, he's like, I've been more of a father to him than you have, and it's almost like Martin being like, yeah, no matter what you do, what you say, I am and always will be his father. You aren't. You just kind of almost like worked your way into like my family's life, essentially. It seems like what Gil is kind of implying. It's actually kind of interesting, because when you actually break that down, Gil only has, to our knowledge, he doesn't really, it doesn't seem like he has a relationship with Ainsley. It seems like he has one with Jessica and Malcolm, but not one with Ainsley. I don't know. I don't know if that's going to be anything. That might be why Ainsley actually goes after the whole Martin situation so wholeheartedly, because she never really had that in her life. Malcolm kind of tiptoes that way. That's because he has a whole bunch of psychological issues, but that side of him is kind of fulfilled because he had Gil in his life. We don't really know if Gil was really there for Ainsley, because Ainsley was so young, so obviously she has her own issues, but I don't think anyone recognized him, because Malcolm was kind of the more like, oh, he's in desperate need of help type of situation, so he seemed more like the one like, hey, waving the red flag of like, yo, gotta help me out, more so than Ainsley was. So maybe that's why. I don't know. Like I said, might be super psychoanalyzing this and looking too deeply into it like that, I didn't even talk about it either, but like, they did interview John's mom, but she wasn't much help. All she kept doing is humming a song, and it was basically talking about like, basically referencing the fact is that Malcolm was going to be another victim, and that all he's going to be is a stain. So she wasn't much help. But the fact of the matter is, Colette, working with JT and Danny, end up checking out the cabin. And I did like how I kind of kept cutting back and forth, because at one point he's hearing a noise, and he's like, oh, like, you have Malcolm thinking that it's a river. Later on turns out not to be the case, but it seems like they're at the cabin. And I love, once again, JT caring by being like, Bright, your skinny ass better still be alive. But when they actually went there, no one was there. Interesting twist when we find out in actuality they've been actually underneath his house the entire time. Because for him, he's been trying to reach out to Malcolm to like, yeah, you become this person, but you're not willing to really kind of take that step yet. But it's like, oh, why? It's because you're like your father. You have a weakness, that being your family. I'm also skipping over the biggest thing where like, it's like the argument that happened is because at first it's like, okay, the woman that was brought along, I thought the argument that John and Martin had was like, that they were supposed to kill her together. But I thought like Martin had kind of pulled the trigger and kind of just like, handled it himself. But it turns out the way John makes it seem like Martin brought Malcolm out there to kill Malcolm, because the chloroform wasn't working as well anymore, and he was starting to remember, so it was kind of an issue. But even Malcolm was like, no, my dad would never kill me. And he's like, well, yeah, that's what happened. You found out John was going to take measures into his own hand because obviously Martin had reservations about it and kind of backed down, and John's like, no, you already got me riled up, we got to get this done, we don't need him talking about our business. So he went there, and obviously Malcolm defended himself and stabbed John. So many different interesting things to kind of break down about that is the fact is, because even like I said, Malcolm was like, no, my dad wouldn't do that, especially how obsessed he is with his children. In particular, Malcolm, you wouldn't think he would do that, but I guess for him it was like a moment of weakness, kind of giving into more his serial killer side of like, I don't want to get caught, I need to be a perfectionist and professional, and I don't get caught. It seemed like that the killer side took over more so than his dad instincts, but his dad instincts eventually kicked back in anyway. Now, another side of that I'm wondering is either John is straight up lying, or there's a part of me wondering if John was actually supposed to be, what if that was actually supposed to be the thing of like, okay, and when it's all said and done, we kill John. I know I'm stretching there, but part of me, because I think the whole point was to get Malcolm involved, kind of get him on the killer bandwagon, but obviously like he didn't like that. Because obviously he had the knife and everything, and there was blood on it, but now we know that blood was John's blood from him stabbing him. So at what point did Martin kill the woman? Was it after fact? And once again, this kind of explains why they have the distant relationship they had, like why John never visited Martin, because it's so interesting. I guess because it would make sense, because it's like, well, because he had talked about the fact is that like he had referenced earlier that they weren't on the same page, that things got complicated with his relationship with Martin, because I guess in the grand scheme of things, that means that Martin chose his son over him, because it's like, oh, you did that? Well, let's clean you up, and hey, let's kind of wipe your memory, but hey, well, because the fact is that would explain why she was in the box, because at first it's like, we're still not full, because I think in my head I kept thinking she was in the box first and then she was in the back of the car. Maybe she was, but time frame wise, I'm thinking it's more so she was in the back of the car. We have an opportunity to kill her, let's put her in a box. But the fact is that Malcolm discovered her, so he took her away and killed her somewhere else. But like I said, we don't have the full time. Maybe they've kind of laid it out to be like, oh, that happened before the hunting trip, but I'm assuming that her being in the box was after the hunting trip. But like I said, I could be wrong. Still a lot we got to figure out there. Circling around to something else interesting, I kind of got to circle back to some points I made earlier, but I want to focus on the Ainsley situation. She's with like a producer, which I'm going to butcher the actress's name. It's Hitine Park. I know I'm butchering her first name. I just think it's interesting. I'm seeing you pop up all over the place, because obviously she's on The Outside right now. I see her in this. I could have sworn there was like a preview to something I saw her in as well. I feel like it was something new, but it might have been previews to Prodigal Son, but I swear it was something different. Now, like I said, I could be wrong, but whatever the case may be, it was interesting because obviously Ainsley's kind of getting a lot more notoriety and stuff like that because of her piece on her dad and stuff like that. But apparently like sexy serial killers or whatever, search wise, is going up like a couple, what's it, like 1,000 or so % or something like that. And then it was interesting because obviously she's like, oh, maybe you can do this, do it, kind of give suggestions. And then Ainsley says something interesting. She's like, maybe rather than focusing on the killer, we should focus more on the victims. That was advice her mom had given her last time. She was kind of upset that her mom wasn't really listening, but it kind of shows like, no, she kind of took time to kind of cool down and kind of look at the different perspective to realize like, yeah, my mom was kind of right. We are kind of glorifying the serial killer too much, especially in this case when the serial killer is my dad, kind of glorifying that a little bit more rather than we should be, focusing on the victims who lost their lives, so I thought that was kind of fascinating. So obviously Ainsley shows up and her mom is kind of like, explaining everything that happened. And obviously she's like, you and Malcolm, you both kind of want to rush forward, kind of always focusing on your dad's past. That's why all this stuff kind of came back. But it's like, no, like, is that what you really brought me here for, Mom? And she's like, hug me. And it's just like, oh, they hugged and everything. So I thought that was neat. But obviously it turns out, and once again, how crazy things work out, because it turns out Ainsley actually has a connection to John, because when she was younger, she thought she had a imaginary friend named Boots. Obviously, Jessica, as well as a whole bunch of psychiatrists, thought it's like, oh, just because of the circumstances, it's okay for someone to create an imaginary friend. But obviously, looking at the pictures of all like those statue stuff that was in John's house, she remembered, and it's like she pulls one out and it's like, oh, this wasn't something from Dad, he got me something different, this is from Boots. And now it correlates that like, oh, Boots was John. But it's like, oh, there was a strange man in our house and you never say anything? She's like, because I thought he was imaginary, because I'd follow him and then he'd disappear. And then because we end up finding out later on that they're under their house, so it kind of makes sense. Like, oh, it's like, I like that information kind of coming out back to back like that. I didn't even talk about it either, but the fact is that John had talked about basically Malcolm stabbing him was kind of his once again, he was born through those trials. He survived and he came out stronger and became, the junkyard killer, which I didn't even talk about it, but even it's like, oh, what do they call him? The junkyard killer. And Martin's like, really? Kind of like, almost kind of like, it's like, oh, kind of a shitty name, don't you think? It's just kind of interesting because he's the surgeon and like, oh, it's so prestigious and this and that, but like, junkyard killer? Wow. Good old John should do better for himself. It almost seemed like, some like serial killer, like, hoity-toityness, which is weird to say, I know. But circling back to what I was trying to bring up earlier, was a whole notion that John was like, you have one weakness that you and your dad share, and that's your family. Like, despite what you could be and what you are, you're always held back. Showing that despite everything, I mean, because that's even proof. Like, he was going to kill potentially, Malcolm, but he pulled back at the last second because, family and stuff like that. So it's like his family was always his weakness, and I guess you can say his family's the reason why he got caught and everything. So it's kind of further proof of that. So John plans on killing them because obviously, Malcolm's like, I have a voice in my head too. It's my dad, but I choose not to listen to him. You don't have to listen to the voice in your head. You could choose to be something different, but John likes listening to his voice. So lo and behold. And then we get the interesting yet almost not interesting shock of like Malcolm's in his own head and trying to find a way out of this situation. His therapist, his psychiatrist, she can't help him. So who does he turn to in a situation like this? His dad's always there in his head. It's just this time you kind of have to listen to him. And I love it. It's like, yeah, you were trying to kill me. He's like, no, that's, I can't deny it. That is true. But come on, that's water under the bridge. It's like, okay. But to be fair, once again, these are manifestation of, Malcolm's psyche kind of manifesting like this, because it's a thing of like, under these circumstances, he needs to kind of like, what would his dad kind of advise him or tell him to do? Because it's like, all right, look at things from this perspective of like, it's like, you need to get out those cuffs. I was thinking like, I was like, well, I'd assume you'd have to dislocate your thumb. Would be kind of the thing. I mean, he does that. Well, I think it's more so than dislocate. I think he straight up breaks it, but it's like, just slip out of the cuffs. He smashes the thumb on one of his fingers, which is like, oh, that's gnarly. Because I guess dislocating is something he's not well trained enough to do. So like a good old hammer strike is good enough. So able to kind of slip out while John is chasing around Ainsley and Jessica, very like shining light, especially when they're in the bathroom. He smashes through and that little sliver, well, that big sliver is out of the door and everything. But Malcolm still bleeding, broken thumb, wrapping his hand up, kind of focusing on it, like, no, this is my family. And I love like while all that's going down, it's like, like Jessica, it takes crazy circumstances like this to kind of bring Jessica and Ainsley together, because Ainsley's bleeding from her head bashing against the door. And it's like, the fact of the matter is everything's kind of, going to be okay, trying to, despite the circumstances, trying to make her, reassure her and everything. So I'm like, oh, it's sad that extreme measures kind of definitely bring up the mother-daughter relationship. But I love Malcolm calling out to John, being like, this is my house and this is my family. I'm like, yo! And so I was wondering, I was like, is Malcolm going to end up killing John kind of in the heat of rage? And then I'm like, oh man, then he's going to end up jump starting kind of what John is like. John's going to get what he wanted in the end. And I guess in a sense, Martin would too. But it turns out not to be the case, because Malcolm set it up so there would be a suitcase, like the box that they end up having the woman in, kind of there. But obviously, like, he's claustrophobic himself, because it's a reminder of him being kind of locked in that closet, clawing to get his way out. And Malcolm knocks him out and locks him in there. And, luckily it was able to save his mom and sister, and they, hug and everything. And it's like, yay, victory. And I like that, Malcolm didn't go down that route, because for him, it's like, I'm not a killer, and I'm not going to, if I killed him, it would give him the satisfaction of pushing me down that direction. It's like, that's not who I'm going to be. I'm the guy who saves the day. I'm the guy who puts away and hunts down the bad guys, So Luckily, everything worked out in the end. Granted, we've still got a lot to fill out, going forward with like whether or not what John said was true. I'm assuming it is, but that was just Malcolm's mind taking in that knowledge, because he doesn't have the full scope of everything that went down on that camping trip. So he just taking John at his words, but it's not like John could be believed. But what does this mean the next time he potentially crosses paths with Martin? There's a lot to kind of consider with all of this. I'm also curious to see what kind of effect this kidnapping is going to have on Malcolm. I mean, to be fair, Malcolm wasn't the most stable person mentally anyway, so we'll see what kind of effects this has, especially because it complicates things even more so, even between him and his dad, despite them already having a very complicated relationship. Either way, we'll see where all this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.